Sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't when a weapon appears. It's when the truth hasn't arrived yet. The afternoon sun hung low over Maple Avenue, warming the cracked sidewalk and the faded bus stop bench where 72-year-old Elijah Brooks had paused to catch his breath. In his right hand was a worn wooden cane polished smooth by decades of use, and in the other a small white pharmacy bag that rustled softly each time the breeze passed. The receipt inside read $12.83 for heart medication he had picked up just minutes earlier. Cars rolled slowly through the intersection, tires humming against the pavement, and somewhere down the block a lawn mower droned in the distance. For most people, it was an ordinary weekday in a quiet American neighborhood measured in short blocks and familiar faces. But in a matter of seconds, that ordinary afternoon began to bend into something tense and confusing. Officer Ryan Mercer stepped out of his patrol car near the curb, his uniform crisp, the radio at his shoulder crackling faintly. People nearby noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere the way you feel the air change before a storm. Mercer's voice cut through the street with sharp authority as he shouted for Elijah to stop moving. The old man froze instinctively, his shoulders stiffening under the pale blue cardigan he always wore when the weather hovered around 70 degrees. His eyes widened with the slow realization that something was wrong, terribly wrong, yet he didn't understand why. Elijah raised both hands carefully, the cane lifting with them, the motion slow and deliberate as though every inch of movement needed permission. The small pharmacy bag slipped slightly from his fingers and rustled again. A few pedestrians had already turned toward the scene. One woman paused beside her parked sedan, keys still dangling from her hand. A teenager across the street lifted his phone without even thinking, the reflex of a generation that records first and asks questions later. "Sir," Elijah said gently, his voice steady but confused, the deep tone of a man who had spent a lifetime speaking calmly to people younger than himself. "That's just my cane." The words floated in the warm air between them, yet tension lingered like a held breath. Mercer's posture remained rigid, his expression tight with urgency that felt out of place against the quiet neighborhood backdrop of mailboxes, trimmed hedges, and front porches. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected, a thin line between misunderstanding and truth. A passing bus slowed at the corner, brakes sighing softly as it stopped to let passengers off. Its windows reflected the scene in fragments: blue uniform, gray hair, raised hands, afternoon sunlight glinting off windshields. From one of those windows, unnoticed by almost everyone on the street, a small camera lens pointed outward. The teenager filming across the road captured only part of the encounter. The woman by the sedan saw something else entirely. But the camera inside that bus quietly recorded every second from the very beginning, including the moment before Officer Mercer ever spoke, before Elijah Brooks even turned around. And that unseen footage was about to change everything anyone thought they understood about what happened on Maple Avenue that day. Elijah Brooks had always believed that quiet days were a gift. For most of his 72 years, life had been measured in simple routines: the slow rhythm of mornings, the smell of fresh wood in a workshop, the steady sound of church bells on Sunday mornings echoing across the neighborhood. Maple Avenue was the kind of place where people knew the color of each other's front doors and the names of each other's dogs. Elijah had built furniture for half the homes on that street decades earlier, long before the gray settled into his beard and the cane became a permanent companion to his steps. That cane had once been part of a sturdy oak chair he made with his own hands nearly 30 years ago. When his knee began to fail after a fall from a ladder in his late 50s, he reshaped a leftover piece of the wood into something that could support him the way his work once supported his family. It was not just a tool for walking. It was a quiet reminder of a life spent building things carefully, patiently, piece by piece. On that warm afternoon, he had only walked 3 blocks from the pharmacy. The receipt folded in the small white bag marked the cost of medication his doctor insisted he never skip. $12.83 was not much by most standards, but Elijah still folded the receipt carefully because habits built over decades rarely disappear. Across the street, the teenager holding the phone kept filming, although he did not fully understand what he was witnessing. To him, it was simply another strange moment on a quiet street, the type of clip that sometimes ended up online. The woman beside the sedan watched Elijah more closely than the officer. She noticed the slight tremble in the old man's fingers and the careful way he balanced his weight against the cane. Nothing about him looked threatening. He looked like someone's grandfather who had walked a little too far under the afternoon sun. Elijah himself was trying to understand how a simple walk home had turned into a moment where every movement felt important. His heart beat faster than usual, something his doctor had warned him about. Stress was not good for him. The doctor had said during a visit just 2 weeks earlier inside a small clinic that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old magazines. Elijah remembered nodding politely during that conversation, promising to take life slowly. Now he stood still on Maple Avenue, hands raised carefully so that everyone could see them. He kept his voice calm because calmness had always carried him through difficult moments in life. Years ago, when he worked long hours in the workshop shaping oak and maple boards into dining tables and rocking chairs, patience had been the difference between a strong piece of furniture and one that cracked under pressure. Patience had also carried him through the quiet years caring for his wife, when illness slowly took her strength. Elijah learned that rushing rarely helped anything. Standing there on the sidewalk, he held on to that same patience. The patrol car idled nearby with a low hum that mixed with the distant sound of traffic lights changing at the next intersection. Sunlight reflected off the windshield in brief flashes that made people squint. From inside the bus stopped at the corner, a passenger adjusted their phone against the glass without realizing that the camera was capturing something important. The scene looked simple from a distance. An officer speaking firmly. An elderly man standing still with a cane. A few curious bystanders watching from across the street. But the truth of a moment often hides inside small details that people overlook at first. And somewhere in those details, recorded quietly from a bus window, was the beginning of a story that would soon reach far beyond Maple Avenue. Officer Ryan Mercer had been on patrol for nearly 6 hours before Maple Avenue appeared on his route that afternoon, and like many streets in the district, it looked quiet enough to pass without attention. Rows of modest houses spaced about 30 feet apart, trimmed hedges, American flags hanging from porch railings, and a small grocery store on the corner where neighbors often stopped for milk or a newspaper. Yet something in Mercer's posture suggested that he had already decided this moment mattered before anyone else realized it. His eyes stayed fixed on Elijah Brooks as though he were studying a puzzle that refused to fit together the way he expected. The patrol car engine continued its low, steady hum behind him, the sound blending with the distant rhythm of traffic lights changing at the intersection half a block away. Mercer's voice carried across the sidewalk again, firm and controlled, asking Elijah to remain exactly where he was. Elijah did not argue. He had learned long ago that calmness often protected a person better than raised voices ever could. Slowly he shifted his weight on the cane, careful not to move too quickly, the polished wood catching the afternoon light. The pharmacy bag in his hand rustled again as a breeze moved down the street, carrying with it the faint scent of fresh cut grass from a nearby yard. People watching from different corners of the block tried to understand what was happening. The woman beside the sedan leaned slightly forward, her eyes moving between the officer and the elderly man. The teenager across the road kept his phone raised, recording silently, his curiosity growing as the moment stretched longer than expected. Inside the city bus that had stopped at the corner, passengers looked through the windows with quiet interest, unaware that one small camera pressed near the glass was capturing the entire scene from a steady angle. Elijah's breathing remained slow and deliberate. The doctor had told him that keeping his heart calm mattered more than anything else, especially on warm days when the air felt heavy and the body tired more quickly. He remembered that advice now and focused on the simple rhythm of inhaling and exhaling. In his life, he had stood in many workshops filled with the scent of oak and maple boards, listening to the steady scrape of sandpaper smoothing rough edges. Those years had taught him patience, the kind that allowed a craftsman to pause before making the next cut. Standing on Maple Avenue, he treated the moment the same way. Mercer took a step closer, studying the cane more carefully, as though the ordinary object still held a question he had not answered yet. Sunlight reflected off the polished surface of the patrol car, sending brief flashes across the pavement that made the scene appear strangely bright and quiet at the same time. Elijah spoke again, his tone respectful and even, explaining that he had just left the pharmacy 3 blocks away and was on his way home where the small white house with green shutters waited at the end of Cedar Street. His words were simple and clear, the kind spoken by someone who believed that truth did not require decoration. For a brief second, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, as though everyone present sensed that the meaning of this moment would not come from loud voices or sudden movement, but from the details quietly unfolding in front of them. None of the people watching could know yet that the calm conversation on Maple Avenue would soon become the center of a much larger story, one that would travel far beyond the quiet neighborhood and into a place where every second of recorded truth would finally be examined with careful attention. The moment should have ended there with a simple explanation and a quiet walk home, but Officer Ryan Mercer did not step back. Instead, he studied Elijah Brooks with a tight expression that suggested the situation had already been decided in his mind. Authority can sometimes arrive before understanding, and on Maple Avenue that afternoon the difference between those two things began to grow wider. Mercer asked Elijah another question, his voice firm, asking him to explain exactly what he was doing in the neighborhood. Elijah blinked slowly, surprised by the question. He had lived 3 streets away for nearly 40 years, long enough to see children grow up, move away, and return with families of their own. Maple Avenue was not unfamiliar territory to him. It was part of the same small grid of streets where neighbors waved from porches and where Elijah had once delivered handmade tables in the back of his old pickup truck. Still, he answered respectfully. He explained that the pharmacy receipt in the bag came from the corner store on Jefferson Street, and that he was walking back to his home on Cedar Street, a distance of about 3 blocks that usually took him 10 or 15 minutes with the help of his cane. The officer listened, but did not immediately relax. Across the street, the teenager filming lowered his phone for a second, glancing at the screen to make sure the recording continued. The woman beside the sedan shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the sun warming the pavement beneath her shoes. From the outside, the scene might have looked ordinary, just a police officer asking questions and an elderly resident answering carefully. But tension lingered in small details. Mercer's shoulders remained stiff. Elijah kept both hands visible even though holding them in the air had begun to tire his arms. The cane rested lightly against his palm, its smooth wooden surface reflecting years of careful use. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the intersection, its tires humming along the asphalt before disappearing around the corner. Time seemed to stretch in the quiet space between each question and answer. Elijah spoke again, adding gently that he had lived in the neighborhood long before many of the houses received their new coats of paint. He mentioned the church 2 blocks away where he used to repair wooden pews and the small park where he once taught his daughter to ride a bicycle nearly 30 years earlier. His words were not defensive. They were simply the memories of a man explaining that he belonged to the place where he stood. Mercer glanced briefly toward the bystanders, now watching more openly. Being observed can change the way people hold themselves, and the awareness of several phones pointed toward the scene added another layer of tension. The bus at the corner remained stopped longer than usual, passengers still boarding slowly through the front door. Inside, a quiet camera continued recording from behind the glass, capturing the angle of the street, the officer's stance, and Elijah's calm posture beneath the bright afternoon sun. The driver glanced at the rearview mirror, noticing the small cluster of people watching the sidewalk scene, but the bus remained where it was for the moment. Elijah finally lowered one hand slightly, careful not to make any sudden movement, and adjusted his grip on the pharmacy bag. He spoke in the same steady tone he had used throughout the conversation, explaining that he simply wanted to finish his walk home because the heat made long stops uncomfortable for his heart. The sentence was simple and sincere, yet it hung in the air like a question waiting for permission to move forward. Everyone watching sensed that the moment was balanced on a thin edge. One decision would allow the street to return to its quiet rhythm. Another could turn an ordinary afternoon into something that people would remember long after the sunlight faded from Maple Avenue. Officer Ryan Mercer did not answer Elijah Brooks right away. The street stayed quiet except for the low idle of the patrol car and the distant hum of traffic 2 blocks away. For a long second, Mercer simply watched the elderly man in front of him, as if he were still trying to fit the calm explanation into a story that already existed in his head. Elijah remained where he stood, shoulders slightly forward, both hands visible, the worn wooden cane resting lightly in his palm. The afternoon sun had begun to soften, turning the bright glare on the pavement into a warmer glow that stretched long shadows across Maple Avenue. The woman beside the parked sedan noticed the tremble in Elijah's fingers again and quietly wondered why the conversation was still continuing. From where she stood, nothing about the old man suggested trouble. He looked like someone who had spent most of his life working with his hands and learning patience from long days and careful effort. Across the street, the teenager kept recording without speaking, the small red light on his phone blinking softly as the camera captured every second. Elijah spoke once more, his voice calm and respectful, explaining again that his home was only 3 blocks away on Cedar Street. He described the small white house with green shutters and the maple tree in the front yard that he planted with his daughter when she was 10 years old. His words were simple and steady, the kind that come from someone who believes truth does not need to be rushed. Mercer asked him to remain still while he checked something on his radio. The device crackled faintly as he spoke into it, his tone controlled but distant. The conversation on the radio was short, a few quiet responses that the people nearby could not fully hear. While the officer listened, Elijah slowly lowered his raised arms a few inches, careful to keep them visible while easing the strain from his shoulders. Standing still for so long had begun to make his breathing heavier, something he knew he had to manage carefully because of his heart. The pharmacy bag rustled again when he adjusted his grip, and the folded receipt inside shifted slightly against the thin paper. The bus at the corner finally closed its doors, but instead of moving immediately, it waited for the traffic light to change. From the inside window, the small camera continued recording the entire scene without interruption. The passengers on board watched quietly, sensing that something about the moment was unusual, even though no one raised their voice and no sudden movement broke the stillness of the street. Mercer finished speaking into the radio and stepped forward again, his expression serious, his attention still fixed on Elijah. The bystanders could feel the tension in the air, even though the afternoon remained calm. Elijah met the officer's gaze with the same steady patience he had carried throughout the entire exchange. He had spent a lifetime believing that dignity was something you kept even when the world around you became uncertain. Maple Avenue remained quiet beneath the fading sunlight, but everyone watching sensed that the moment had not reached its end yet. Something about the hesitation, the long pause, and the unseen camera recording from the bus window suggested that what was happening on this quiet street was only the beginning of a story that would soon move far beyond the sidewalks of the neighborhood. The traffic light at the corner finally turned green, and the city bus rolled forward with a slow mechanical sigh, its heavy frame moving through the intersection as the late afternoon sunlight stretched longer shadows across Maple Avenue. Inside the bus, the quiet camera pressed against the glass continued to record for a few more seconds before the vehicle disappeared down Jefferson Street, carrying with it a silent record of everything that had happened on the sidewalk. Back on the curb, Elijah Brooks remained standing where he had been the entire time, steadying himself with the familiar weight of the wooden cane that had supported him for more than a decade. His breathing was controlled but slightly heavier now, the result of standing still under the warm sun for longer than his body preferred. He remembered the doctor's voice again, calm and direct during that last appointment. Take things slowly. Avoid stress. Keep your heart steady. Elijah tried to follow that advice now, focusing on the rhythm of each breath. Officer Ryan Mercer watched him carefully, his expression still guarded as though the explanation he had heard did not fully settle the uncertainty in his mind. Around them, the quiet neighborhood began to return to its normal rhythm. A car turned onto Maple Avenue and slowed when the driver noticed the patrol vehicle parked near the curb. A pair of joggers on the far sidewalk passed by with curious glances, but did not stop. The woman beside the sedan finally lowered her hand from the car door and stood with her arms folded, her attention still fixed on the 2 men at the center of the scene. She had lived in the neighborhood long enough to recognize Elijah Brooks. She remembered seeing him years earlier carrying wooden boards into his garage workshop, always moving slowly but with quiet determination. The teenager across the street continued recording, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as the moment stretched longer. For him it had started as a simple curiosity, but now he sensed that something about this encounter might matter later. Elijah spoke again in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. He explained that the pharmacy bag held medication he needed to take that evening, and that his home was only a short walk away. He pointed gently with the tip of his cane towards Cedar Street at the end of the block, careful not to move too quickly. The gesture was small, almost humble, but it carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. Mercer followed the direction of the cane for a brief second, his eyes tracing the row of houses that lined the street. The sunlight reflected off the windows of those homes, bright squares of light that seemed to watch the scene along with everyone else. For a moment, the tension softened slightly, as though the ordinary details of the neighborhood were beginning to challenge the suspicion that had started the encounter. Elijah lowered his hands completely now, resting both of them lightly on the curved handle of the cane. His shoulders relaxed just enough to ease the strain in his back. The street remained calm, yet the feeling in the air suggested that the story unfolding on Maple Avenue had not reached its turning point yet. Somewhere down Jefferson Street, the bus carrying that quiet camera continued along its route, unaware that the recording inside it had captured the first piece of a truth that would soon travel far beyond this quiet block and into a place where every second of what happened that afternoon would be examined with careful attention. By the time the sun lowered another inch over Maple Avenue, the quiet street had begun to feel different. Not louder, not chaotic, but heavier, as if the air itself understood that the moment had already traveled farther than anyone standing there could see. Elijah Brooks shifted his weight slightly against the wooden cane, the familiar curve of the handle resting in his palm, like an old friend that had walked beside him through many seasons of life. His breathing had settled again, slow and measured, the way his doctor had taught him to control it whenever stress tried to rise in his chest. Officer Ryan Mercer still stood several feet away, watching Elijah with the careful focus of someone who sensed that the situation was slipping out of the simple explanation he had expected. Across the street, the teenager lowered his phone for a moment and checked the screen, replaying a few seconds of the recording he had just captured. From his angle, the scene looked incomplete, like a puzzle with pieces missing from the beginning. He could see Elijah raising his hands, the officer speaking firmly, the bystanders gathering. But something about the order of those moments did not seem entirely clear. The teenager lifted the phone again and kept recording, not realizing that somewhere farther down Jefferson Street another recording already existed that would answer the question none of them could yet see. Meanwhile, the city bus that had carried the silent camera continued along its route through several blocks of afternoon traffic before stopping again near a small transit station. Passengers stepped down onto the sidewalk, conversations beginning and ending in the ordinary rhythm of a weekday commute. Among them was a young college student named Daniel Reyes who had been sitting near the window during the stop on Maple Avenue. Daniel often filmed short clips during his bus rides, mostly city scenery or passing streets, something he later stitched together into quiet travel videos for his small online channel. He had barely paid attention to the encounter outside the bus at the time. To him, it was simply another moment on a city street. But when he later glanced at the recording stored on his phone, something unusual caught his eye. The first few seconds of the video showed the sidewalk before anyone spoke, before Elijah even turned around. The patrol car door had already opened. The officer had already stepped out. The timeline in Daniel's footage began earlier than any other camera present that afternoon. Back on Maple Avenue, the bystanders remained in place as the conversation between Mercer and Elijah slowed into careful silence. The woman beside the sedan glanced at the officer and then at Elijah, sensing that the situation was gradually shifting away from the tension that had started it. Elijah stood quietly, both hands resting on the top of his cane now, the pharmacy bag hanging loosely from his fingers. The late sunlight reflected softly against the windows of the nearby houses, casting warm light across the street that had witnessed the entire encounter. None of the people standing there could know yet that the truth of those few minutes on Maple Avenue had already been preserved from the very first second, carried away unknowingly on a phone inside a departing bus, waiting for the moment when someone would finally watch the footage closely enough to understand what really happened before anyone else started recording. 2 days later, the quiet moment on Maple Avenue began to travel far beyond the neighborhood where it first happened. Daniel Reyes sat at a small table inside a campus coffee shop with his laptop open, the faint sound of espresso machines and afternoon conversations filling the background. Like he often did after class, He reviewed the clips recorded on his phone during his bus ride across the city. Most of the footage showed ordinary streets sliding past the window, traffic lights changing from red to green, pedestrians crossing intersections beneath the bright afternoon sun. But one clip made him pause. It was the recording from the bus stop on Maple Avenue. At first it looked unremarkable, the camera angled slightly through the bus window, capturing the sidewalk and the patrol car parked near the curb. Yet, when Daniel watched the clip more carefully, he noticed something important. His video started several seconds earlier than the clips already circulating online. In the footage being shared across social media, the story seemed to begin with Elijah Brooks already facing the officer with his hands raised. But Daniel's camera showed the moment before that. The patrol car door opened first. Officer Ryan Mercer stepped out and spoke before Elijah even turned around. The sequence was clear and steady, recorded without interruption through the glass of the bus window. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, replaying the first few seconds again. The difference was subtle but powerful. In the version spreading online, people were arguing about what might have happened before the recording began. In Daniel's video, that question already had an answer. Meanwhile, across the city, Elijah Brooks had returned home to the small white house on Cedar Street. The maple tree in his front yard moved gently in the afternoon breeze, while sunlight filtered through its leaves and scattered across the porch steps. Inside the house, the quiet felt familiar again. Elijah placed the pharmacy bag on the kitchen table and sat down slowly, resting both hands on the wooden cane. The long day had left him tired, but his calm patience remained the same. He had lived long enough to understand that sometimes the truth moved slowly before it reached the right place. Back at the coffee shop, Daniel exported the video file from his phone and watched the opening sequence one more time. The camera captured the full street, the patrol car arriving, the officer stepping out, and Elijah turning only after hearing the voice behind him. It was a simple recording, but its timing told a story that the other videos could not explain. Daniel hesitated for a moment, considering whether the clip mattered enough to share. Outside the coffee shop window, cars moved steadily through the late afternoon traffic, while pedestrians crossed the street carrying backpacks and shopping bags. The world continued its ordinary pace. Yet inside the laptop screen, Maple Avenue remained frozen in that quiet moment before the conversation even began. Daniel finally uploaded the video to his computer, knowing that sometimes a small piece of truth could change the way an entire story was understood. And far away from the coffee shop, in places where the earlier clips had already sparked questions and debates, that missing first moment from Maple Avenue was about to be seen for the very first time. 3 days after the quiet afternoon on Maple Avenue, the story that had once lived only on a small neighborhood sidewalk arrived in a place where every detail mattered. The courtroom felt cooler than the outside air, the tall windows filtering pale sunlight across polished wooden benches and the quiet murmur of people waiting for the session to begin. Elijah Brooks sat calmly near the front, both hands resting on the familiar curve of his wooden cane, the same cane that had walked beside him for more than a decade. He wore the same patience on his face that had carried him through the encounter on the sidewalk. Across the room, Officer Ryan Mercer sat at the defense table, his posture rigid, his eyes focused forward as though the polished floor held the answers he was searching for. The room grew still when Judge Judith Whitaker entered and took her seat at the bench. Her voice carried the steady authority of someone who had spent years examining moments exactly like this one. Moments where small details decided the meaning of an entire story. The earlier videos from Maple Avenue had already been reviewed, each clip showing the same narrow slice of the encounter, beginning after Elijah had turned and raised his hands. For days people had debated those images, arguing about what might have happened before the recordings began. Then the clerk connected a laptop to the courtroom screen and opened the file Daniel Reyes had submitted. The video filled the display in quiet clarity. The first frame showed Maple Avenue before any words were spoken, the patrol car pulling to the curb, the door opening, the officer stepping out before Elijah even turned around. The sequence unfolded slowly across the screen, every second clear and uninterrupted through the bus window where the camera had quietly captured the truth from the beginning. The room remained silent as the final seconds played. Judge Whitaker leaned slightly forward, studying the timeline with careful attention before speaking. Her voice was calm, but unmistakably firm as she explained what the recording revealed. The moment everyone believed was the beginning had actually started earlier. The first words came from the officer before Elijah Brooks had even turned to face him. The difference of those few seconds changed the entire meaning of the encounter. Across the room, Elijah remained still, his hands resting on the cane, his expression steady. He did not celebrate or speak loudly when the judge concluded that the earlier assumptions about the situation were incomplete. He simply nodded once, the quiet gesture of someone who believed the truth did not need decoration once it had finally been seen. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun warmed the stone steps as Elijah walked slowly toward the sidewalk, the cane tapping gently against the ground with each step. Cars moved along the street, people passed by, and the city continued its steady rhythm just as it had on Maple Avenue days earlier. Yet for those who had watched the recording unfold in the courtroom, one simple lesson lingered in the silence that followed. Sometimes the most important part of a story is not the moment everyone sees first. It is the quiet second that happened before the cameras began recording.